All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Southeast Collaborative Online Conference. My name is Lauren Clossy, and I will be your host for this session, which will discuss using universal design concepts to make your library more accessible and inclusive. This event is supported through funding from the Library Services and Technology Act through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Before we get started, I have a few things to share with you. This session will be recorded and will be archived, and a link will be sent out next week to you with access to the archive session. If you happen to be watching this webinar as a group, we would love to hear about it so that we can have an accurate head count for our records. So please, if you're watching it as a group, please send us an email. You can send any of the hosts an email with the names of the people watching with you, or you can contact your state's person if they're hosting one of these events. You can contact them directly, but that way we want to get a more accurate head count of how many people are here. But we're so glad if you are watching as a group, we're so glad that you provided that opportunity. At the end of the presentation today, you will have an opportunity to submit questions to the presenter, and so you'll want to be sure that you type those into the chat area if you can. And so that will be on the button. It'll be the third button from the right, the little bubble, speech bubble. That is the chat function. So please use that when you're going to type in any questions, and we will help moderate those questions at the end of the webinar. You'll receive CEUs for this session and all of the other sessions included in the Southeast Collaborative Conference. So look for a survey link in your inbox on Friday this week with more information on that. If you happen to run into some tech issues today with sound, be sure to go up to the Communicate tab at the top of the screen and check your audio connection with your computer audio. Go up to that tab and use that to see. And if not, you can type to us in the chat area, and we can help you. We can help you further troubleshoot if you have some sound issues. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Carli Spina, who is the Associate Professor and Head of Research and Instructional Services for the Fashion Institute of Technology. Carli has extensive experience teaching and publishing and working on projects related to accessibility and inclusion and serving patrons with disabilities. So thanks so much to Carli for being with us today. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me, Lauren? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so as Lauren mentioned, today we're going to be talking about how you can use universal design to make your library more accessible and inclusive. She told you a little bit about me, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit more quickly. I came to this interest in part because I have a background in law, librarianship, and education, so I'm really interested in sort of how accessibility and universal design work at the intersection of all those fields. Because of that, I've done a lot of classwork and gained a lot of experience in disability services and about universal design. And I think it's a really important topic for libraries. So I teach a lot of professional development courses through which I've been able to hear about how a lot of different libraries are approaching this and what sorts of projects they're undertaking. So today we're going to weave in some of the libraries that I've been to and seen online as well. So let's start by talking about what accessibility is so that we can contrast it a little bit with universal design. So accessibility often refers to, especially in a United States context, things that comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It also refers to things that offer access for people with disabilities. But generally speaking, there's an assumption in that this might be something that's a retrofit. So for example, in this picture here, you see an example of a wheelchair lift by a long set of stairs. And the reason that can be a suboptimal option for people is because this is only usable by people with certain types of disabilities. For example, if you don't use a wheelchair, but maybe you use a cane or you have some mobility issues, it can be difficult or impossible to use a wheelchair lift. And then you're confronted with stairs with no other way of using them. Another issue is that often things can be considered accessible, even if it means that somebody has a different solution that separates them from the rest of the users. So that's often referred to as an accommodation. So you might have a section of your library that isn't accessible to people with disabilities, and therefore you offer the option to page books as an accommodation for them and to have them pick those books up elsewhere in the library. And that obviously is very helpful for those people, but it offers them a different experience. They don't get to browse, they can't make other uses, such as using those pieces of the library for study space, or interacting with the people who are in those areas of the library. Universal design grew out of sort of the architecture movement, around making things more accessible as a response to these limitations with accessibility. It was developed by an architect who himself used a wheelchair, due to having had polio, named Ronald L. Mace. And the term is defined as the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And there's a few pieces of this that I want to mention. So the first piece of the definition that's important is that this is not merely an architectural concept. It's really anything you can think of. And in fact, people have applied frameworks based on universal design, even to developing course materials, curricula, programs, everything you can think of. So it's really not just architecture alone. It can really be anything you can design. The next piece I want to call attention to is that it's to the greatest extent possible. We'll talk more about some of the limitations of universal design at the end of the presentation, but one of the things that people often have as a critique of universal design is that, well, it's never possible for one solution to work equally well for everyone. But in reality, this definition of universal design acknowledges that. And instead, it's sort of a challenge to designers and a challenge to those who are creating services and spaces and programs in libraries to try to keep in mind all the different types of users there are and to serve the needs of the greatest number of users rather than designing only with the person that you think of as the average or normal user in your mind. And finally, it's saying the last piece says without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And that was to move away from a model that really did rely on accommodations. And accommodations can be problematic for a few different reasons. So on the hierarchy of designing to provide access for all people, I would say that accommodations are sort of at the bottom, then inborn accessibility is next up. And then the best solution, in my opinion, is universal design. And the reason for that is simply because with accommodations, you're really, if you need to adapt something for someone, if you need to respond to a need after you've received a request, at that point, you're already putting a lot of the burden on the person who has the need to approach you, to be able to state what their own need is, to wait for you to be able to come up with a response to that. And often to be able to accept something that isn't necessarily as good of a solution. Often with accommodations, it will end up being a situation where you're not getting quite full use. You're only getting the use of the major features of a service, or you're being separated from the rest of the users while being able to use something. And so accommodations have a lot of limitations inherent with them. And you have accessibility, and a lot of libraries strive very hard to meet accessibility standards in their location, with obviously some having more or less success with that based on things such as the age of their building, the amount of budget that they're able to allocate towards this. But accessibility, I think, is something that everyone at least strives for, especially since it became federal law under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But the issue with accessibility is that, again, there can often be some sorts of limitations. So for example, buildings are often made accessible if they have stairs by the main entrance by putting a ramp at another entrance. So I can't tell you how many times I've been to a building where most people, 90% of the users enter through the front door, and the only accessible entrance is around the back, often at the loading dock. And so this offers an option to use the space, but it's usually not necessarily as nice of an option. And it does require people to sort of self-segregate themselves into a different area of the building, into a different experience that they might have than other people. Another great example of this is if you've been to a movie theater, you've likely seen that they have some accessible seating, usually only in one or two parts of the theater. So again, it's offering you the experience, but it's not offering you the flexibility and choice that other users have. It's not offering you the ability to necessarily sit with your entire party. And then finally, universal design aims to try to address these needs in a way that offers an experience that works for everyone. Sometimes that's because of its flexibility. Sometimes that's because of the way it's inherently designed, even without needing to be flexible. But the idea is that it's trying to meet the needs of all users with a single design rather than asking them to use a separate design when using the space or service. Universal design benefits a lot of people. And one of the other things that I think is really important to understand about universal design is that it's not something that's only related to people with disabilities. Now, individuals with disabilities are a very important part of our community. They make up about 15% of the population worldwide, and there are greater than 40 million Americans who have disabilities. So I certainly don't mean to discount the importance of offering an inclusive experience for people with disabilities. That's a huge and important service that libraries can offer, I think, is the ability for people with disabilities to make equal use of our spaces, our services, our programs, et cetera. But one of the nice things about universal design, as opposed to adherence to accessibility standards, is that it tries to take into account other people who might be able to benefit. So it takes into account older adults who may not consider themselves disabled, who may not even have any declining health, but for whatever reason may just not be able to use quite the same things they used to before. For example, an excellent example of this is universal design is often a reason that libraries redesign their stacks to try to make more of their books easily reachable by people who maybe aren't that tall, people who may be using wheelchairs, etc. And that can also benefit older adults who probably shouldn't necessarily be safely navigating step stools or ladders that some libraries still provide access to for patrons. So this allows them to have equal use of the space. Another group that's really benefited and kept in mind for universal design purposes is, I'm saying non-native English speakers, since English is the predominant language in the United States, but basically anyone who doesn't speak the predominant language of the location. We'll see more in the little bit later on in this presentation that universal design really thinks about how to communicate things to make them clearly understandable in a lot of different circumstances, which can be very inclusive if you have a population that's made up of people who have varying levels of comfort in written and spoken English. It's also really great for people who might be low literacy. A lot of the features of universal design can help people who are distracted, and really it can help anyone who isn't sort of at the average. This is something that allows, spaces that are designed for universal design are more flexible, so they can help people who are very tall by offering more flexible seating options. So really anybody you can think of who's outside of the sort of standard that people think of when they think of their user benefits from a well-implemented universal design process. And that's really important for libraries because I think more than a lot of other groups, libraries really do work with populations that are incredibly diverse in a lot of different ways. We see people from all different types of populations making use of our spaces and services in all types of different ways, some of which we might have thought of in advance and some of which we may not have thought of. So I think that universal design works really well for libraries because a part of our mission usually is serving a really wide and almost unknown and unknowable group of people. Anybody who comes in the door of a public library, we're generally hoping to be able to serve them. So by designing with this sort of thing in mind, you have the opportunity to be able to present somebody immediately upon their arrival without them having to ask for any specific special assistance with something that works well for them. So what's an example of universal design? First, I want to start by just talking about some examples. So we talked about the definition, but I want this is something that you see every day in your life. Probably you see some examples of universal design. One of the quintessential examples, which was actually designed before the term universal design was even coined, is the curb cut. So curb cuts are something that you see all over the place now, but they actually didn't develop that long ago. They developed sort of in the middle of the last century, and they were initially not necessarily even intended to benefit people with disabilities. One town that put them in place because they had a large veteran population, but another town that was one of the very first to put them in place in England did it mostly because they thought that it would be helpful for parents pushing strollers. And that's one of the great things about curb cuts and about universal design is that this is a single design that can help so many different people. It's helpful to people who use wheelchairs. It's helpful to people who have difficulty going up a step. It's helpful to people who are pushing a stroller. It's helpful to people for people who are pushing a large cart with heavy items on it. There's really just a lot of different ways in which curb cuts make things easier. So it's really a good example of something that has had these huge benefits. And now a lot of people who see a curb cut probably just take it for granted and don't even necessarily think about what the initial use cases for it were, because it really just makes walking down the street so much easier for everyone. Now, a second example of universal design that's in this picture is this textured sidewalk surface that you see here. So this can help a lot of different people as well. This surface is initially intended to allow people with visual impairments to more easily tell that they were coming to the edge of something. So whether that's the edge of a sidewalk, they're often put on public transportation and at train stations by the edge of the platform. But now it serves the same purpose for lots of other people. Anyone who's looking down or distracted while they're walking can immediately tell that they're walking on a different surface. It has the added advantage of helping to ensure that there isn't quite the same freezing pattern in a lot of climates on the curb cut when it's wintry. So there's a lot of different reasons why this benefits more than just the one person. Some other day-to-day examples of universal design that I'm sure most, if not all of you have seen. The automatic door. This seems like something that's just very easy to look past at this point. They're all over the place, but it's another good example of something that is universally designed. Whether you have your hands full or you're pushing a cart or you're using a wheelchair, it works equally well for everyone. Similarly, a lot of people probably even perhaps have these types of doorknobs in their homes, but they're actually were originally designed not just to be aesthetically pleasing, but to make it easier for people who have manual dexterity issues. For example, somebody who has arthritis, somebody can open the door just by pressing on the lever as opposed to being able to grab and turn a doorknob. So in libraries, you may already have come across something of what I talked about that is an example for your library. Plenty of libraries have curb cuts in their parking lots, automatic doors, those types of doorknobs. There's lots of different things that maybe could apply in a library setting. But some libraries are also doing some really exciting stuff that is specific to their library. So for example, the Liverpool Central Library has created a tactile floor plan. And this floor plan is great because it not only includes Braille, but it also has a mix of text and symbols, which we'll see is an important part of universal design because it makes things more universally perceptible, more understandable by people who either are too busy to bother reading or are unable to read your sign because of either the language it's in or their reading level. It makes use of colors as well, so that somebody can tell at a glance what is going on in different locations. And it's really very easy to just kind of get a grasp of very quickly what they're talking about. So now that you've seen those examples, hopefully these 7 principles will make a little bit more sense. The foundation of universal design is these 7 principles. After the definition of universal design was developed, people who developed it really realized that without more, it was very hard to tell a designer or an architect who didn't have experience with these sorts of design problems what exactly they needed to do to implement it. So what was their next step? They wanted to make something that was maximally usable for everyone, but what did they need to think about? What did they need to ask themselves? What were the most important factors for them to consider? And because of that, several years after the initial definition was released, they sat down and developed as a group this list of 7 principles. And these 7 principles are sort of a checklist, if you think of it that way, of how you can make sure that you are keeping in mind all the issues you need to ensure that you have a universally designed solution. So the first one is equitable use, and we're going to look at all these in depth after this initial list. So the first one is equitable use. The second one is flexibility in use. The third one is simple and intuitive use. Next, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. And taken together, these are really meant not to be the be all end all of universal design, but to be the things that you need to think about whenever designing something or whenever redesigning or evaluating something as a way of making sure that you're touching upon everything. Now, these 7 principles won't necessarily all apply equally in all situations, but they're a good core set of principles to consider when you're trying to apply universal design. So let's look at them all in more depth. So the first principle is equitable use. And basically, this goes back to what I was saying about accessibility often involving a separate solution for people with disabilities. Under the equitable use principle, the idea is that whatever the design is, it should be usable as a single design equally by all users. So an excellent example of this is this picture is a picture of a museum here in New York City, the Getty Museum, and it is built around, the entire museum is built around a large spiraling ramp. And so everyone uses the ramp. There are technically stairs. There's also an elevator if you want to navigate a different way. But the vast majority of people use a single ramp that is, the artwork is displayed on the sides of the ramp. And this means that no matter whether you can do stairs or not, you can not only see all of the museum, but you can in fact be together with all the other museum patrons without having to need to go and find a separate elevator that's intended specifically for your use. Other things we've already looked at also are clearly obeying this equitable use sort of principle. So we talked about the automatic doors. That's an excellent example. With automatic doors, anyone can use the automatic door. It doesn't have to be because you need to use it because of a disability, but at the same time, you don't have to be someone who's able-bodied to be able to use it either. Next, we have flexibility in use. So flexibility in use means that you want to provide different ways for people to use the item whenever possible. You want to acknowledge that people might have different preferences and might have different needs, and that in fact their preferences and needs might be situationally dependent, so they might even change from day to day for whatever reason. So this door is a nice example of that because it has the universally designed style of doorknob, but it also has a button you can push to have the door automatically open and a separate button you can push to request assistance if you need it. So that might be something that is very useful depending on the situation you're in. A library I used to work at, for example, had a easy to use doorknob and also an automatic push button door opener as well on one of their main doors. And that was great, not only for people who had mobility impairments, but also let's say you were pushing a book truck and you didn't want to have to try to open the door yourself. You could easily just push the button and the door would open for you. So there's flexibility that the same person might use the item differently from day to day. There's also flexibility that different users who have different needs might use it. So an excellent example of that would be scissors that can be used equally well by right-handers and left-handers. For a long time, scissors tended to be right-handed scissors, and then they sort of separately developed left-handed scissors. But if you have scissors, for example, at a service desk, who knows who's going to be using them? So the idea of redeveloping that as something that could be used by anybody is one that was really important and helpful to the design of this product because it gives you that flexibility that anybody can share and use the same item without having to get something that was specialized for their particular needs. Next up is simple and intuitive design. And there's lots of examples of this. One example that I've used a lot in the past is how when you talk about those water coolers that have a big bottle of water at the top and then have the option to select hot or cold water, you may have never noticed, but in fact, they actually not only have the hot and cold water demarcated with colors, but also always have them, all different brands, always have the cold water on the same side and the hot water on the same side. And that's so that it's simple and intuitive. Somebody who's used a different version of it isn't going to be confused when they encounter this new version. They're going to be able to quickly understand how to use it. Another excellent example of this is something like this defibrillation machine. You can see here that not only does it have instructions in multiple places, but it also has diagrammed instructions that don't assume that anyone is going to be reading lengthy instructions. Everything is clearly marked. There's a big arrow to the button that you need to push. They use the I symbol for information and the battery symbol for battery, which are sort of universal at this point. And that's because this is intended to be used in an emergency situation. And they understand that people aren't going to be sitting there and pulling out the handbook and reading it if there's an actual emergency. So again, there are certain things where intuitive design is even more important, but a really good design is one that is simple and doesn't require people to do a lot of thought and study to come up with how to use it. And I think that that's something that we are, as librarians and as library professionals, are always trying to advocate for improving. And we've seen a lot of improvement in that because certainly even just in my time using electronic databases, that's something that we're always advocating for. It started out when electronic databases were new, that they were very difficult to use and everyone was different and everyone had to have special training to know how to do commands in them. And slowly but surely they're moving towards something where it's an intuitive product that people can hopefully use the catalog pretty easily, hopefully can use electronic databases without having to do a great deal of study in how to use them. And that's how you want to make all of your library offerings, as something that is on its surface very intuitive to users. Perceptible information, I already mentioned this one, but it's a very important one that when done well can be very useful to a lot of different people. Basically, perceptible information means that you want to try to make sure that whatever information you're trying to convey is perceptible to the greatest number of people possible. So one aspect of that is accessibility. If you are talking about something like online information, a key part of this principle is making sure that that information is in a system or a style that is available to people who use assistive devices. So for example, your catalog should be one that works with all sorts of screen readers and other types of assistive devices people might use to navigate the web. But this is also something that's really important in our signage and our print materials. So this example here is from a library at the University of York. And I think they just did such a great job because, again, this is very, very obvious information. It's very clear, and it doesn't require you to read a lot of information. They do include some information written in text because that might be some people's preference, but they back that up with symbols so that even if you walked up to this and you weren't very familiar with English, or you were quickly walking past it and only glancing at it but not reading the details, you have a pretty good sense quite quickly that it's a solo workspace, so you probably shouldn't be talking. You're only allowed to be sort of thinking to yourself. And okay, now at the bottom, it's telling me water's allowed, but all these other things aren't allowed. And so that's something where they really have done a nice job of conveying this information very clearly to anyone. Now, another nice thing about this, in a way that it works for another one of the principles, is that they've also created zones in their library. And that's a great example of flexibility. They haven't said, like, people who come to the library must be planning to work silently. Instead, they've offered the flexibility for people to decide for themselves what works best for them by offering different zones that are clearly marked and clearly set off from one another, and saying, here's one to work in if you want silence. Here's one if you want sort of quiet, but it doesn't have to be perfectly silent. And here's another space for collaborative work. And that's also really nice to offer that flexibility in how your spaces are used, in addition to what your spaces actually are. Tolerance for error is another big one where I think our electronic information is really allowing us to meet people where they are and allow more for error. Tolerance for error is often thought of as things where you're not going to have a dangerous outcome if someone uses something incorrectly. So for example, a good example of that is surge protectors. They are something that allows you to automatically have the power be cut off if someone tries to overuse an outlet. So they're going to make sure that even if someone makes an error in what they can use it for, it's still not going to cause a dangerous problem. But tolerance for error can really mean a lot more than that. And one of the things that I think is really great about the direction libraries are moving in is that we are changing a lot of our systems, things like catalogs, which is what this example comes from, so that they have a lot more support for people who might make errors. So here you'll see an example of a catalog where if you have a typo in your answer, much like Google, it's going to provide you with this "did you mean?" And I think that's a really great way to support our users where they are. It supports people who don't type well. It supports people who are in a hurry and therefore have a typo, who are working on mobile devices where it's much more difficult to accurately type. But it also supports people who have various types of learning differences, people who might need some support in English language learning contexts, and it really provides a more welcoming experience rather than getting to a situation where because you're one letter off, you get 0 results. Instead, you're going to get a concrete suggestion about how it might be that you change your search and what it might be that went wrong. Other things that are similar in library systems is there's increasingly systems that also provide suggestions. So if you run a search for one keyword in an area, they might suggest to you, oh, also try these other keywords. And that's another good example of helping people to move beyond whatever their initial conception might be to a more full understanding of what's available to them, even if their initial presumption wasn't something that we would consider correct. And meeting people where they are with this type of tolerance for error not only helps them to have a better experience in terms of what they actually achieve and what they actually find, but it also makes the library much more approachable because I think it's easy to forget working in libraries and trying to be welcoming that a lot of people can find libraries very intimidating and can in fact find them to be places that maybe aren't necessarily meant for them and can think that research isn't something that's really meant for them if they're an English language learner, if they are low literacy, if there's somebody who does have a learning disability. There are a lot of people who might not feel particularly welcome in these environments, not necessarily because of anything other than their own assumptions, but still these sorts of tools and this sort of focus on having tools that do help people to overcome their errors even when they're working solo really goes a long way towards improving outcomes and making a more welcoming and inclusive space for people. Low physical effort. So this one is pretty intuitive in what it means, but it's exactly that as a means of trying to be more accommodating for people who are have some sort of a disability, who maybe are aging, who maybe are under the weather and therefore feeling kind of weak, maybe a parent who's holding a child at the same time. You just want to try to think about ways that you can make things as low physical effort as possible. This is an example here where it's something where it's just an easy to pull out plug. But I think that there are a lot of ways that libraries can also make use of this idea, such as thinking about how heavy the doors are in your building and how easy they are to open. Thinking about how easy or difficult it is to close the stalls in your bathroom. That's one that I find very commonly can be something overlooked. What are the types of closures that you have in those stalls? And are they something that is easy to do, or does it require a lot of physical effort and a lot of manual dexterity? It's thinking about those sorts of things that falls under this low physical effort idea. And then finally, size and space for approach and use. So I think for this one, people tend to think most frequently in their mind, they think immediately of making things accessible for people who might use wheelchairs to navigate your library, but it's really much more than that. So this desk is a really great example. It's from Bonner Springs Library. And you'll see that it has 2 different levels that people can approach at. And that's really helpful for 2 reasons. First of all, I think most of us, when we're thinking about these things, are thinking about our patrons, but you have to also think about library employees whenever you're thinking about making welcoming and easy to use spaces, because at the end of the day, the library employees are probably the people who use those spaces the most. And this sort of a desk offers the option that somebody who has a long desk shift can sit if they want, they can stand if they want, they could sit on a regular size chair or one of the taller bar stool chairs if you had those. There's a lot of different options about how an employee might be at this space, which is nice, especially if you're asking people to work relatively long desk shifts. At the same time, patrons can also approach and use this desk in a number of different ways. It's got a lot of nice clearance because it's this curved space. And because it does have the different levels, everything from a person who's in a wheelchair could easily come up and be independently able to check out books themselves, but at the same time, also a child. So someone who's small might be able to come up and walk up and do this as well. It's also just more comfortable for people. I myself am 4'10", and I can say that a lot of times counters that are built to be up high for adults to use are still even at the edge of what is comfortable for me if I have to set something on them. So I think it just makes it nicer if there's a few different options. Another approach that you can take to this is instead, some libraries have employed movable and adjustable desks that can be at different heights and also move to different locations. And they use that for their checkout. And this is nice because it does allow you to not only move things up and down per the needs of the person staffing the desk and the needs of the person who's approaching the desk, but it also means that you could, if you needed to, move it to a different location, whether for an event or for use by specific people. So those are the 7 principles, but now I want to get back to what I was saying about how there are some limitations that people have pointed out for universal design. And I don't want to paint the picture that, just thinking about, saying, okay, we're going to universally design this is enough to ensure that it's going to be a complete success. There are things that you need to think about, limitations. So think to yourself for a moment about what you see as the potential limitations to this approach. And if you want, you can even share some of your ideas in the chat so that others can see them. Okay, so one of the biggest limitations of universal design, I think, or one of the biggest potential pitfalls of universal design, is that even still to this day, often people with disabilities, people who are English language learners, people in all different communities, people who are elderly, that we're trying to serve aren't involved in the decision-making process, either as people who are making the decisions or even as people who are included in user tests or focus groups, or any sorts of surveying, even in some cases. And the problem with that is that while people might have the best of intentions, sometimes that means that they aren't necessarily experts in thinking about what the needs of those groups actually are. And I like to use this staircase as what I think of as a very good example of this. So this staircase is actually in Vancouver, which I think is relevant because it is someplace that gets cold weather, which I think makes it even more potentially problematic. But this is a staircase that's sort of meant to be usable as either a ramp or a staircase, which on paper is a great idea. But looking at this staircase as somebody who has in the past used a wheelchair, it seems like it would be terrifying to navigate in a wheelchair because one false move and you're actually going down the stairs. There isn't much of a protective lip. There isn't really any at some points. And even aside from that, people who had any type of visual impairment, this is very difficult to look at and understand if you don't have full vision. So in reality, while it may technically allow people to use it as either a ramp or a staircase, it's actually something that would be very difficult to use in the best of times, and in bad weather with ice and snow seems like it would be almost impossible to use safely. So it's a very cool looking project that I think the designers had their heart in the right place, but at the end of the day, it's not something that actually meets the needs of the communities that they were hoping to be able to include through this design. And I think that that's one of the problems of universal design, is that there is this sense that it's not necessarily going to, there are people who are doing the design might not be able to think about all of the important issues that come with the needs of people in these different groups. And particularly when we talk about the needs of people with disabilities, another common concern or limitation of universal design is that if you are thinking to yourself, I'm trying to meet the needs of everyone, sometimes if people aren't very conscious of this potential unconscious bias, the needs of people with disabilities can be the first to get cut when people aren't sure that they have the budget or the ability to do everything. So their needs can actually get subsumed by the needs of other groups, even in projects that initially start out hoping to be universally designed. In some settings, it can also be difficult to implement these changes due to competing priorities, which is a similar but slightly different subset. I think that sometimes in some settings, the idea of universal design starts off as a really great idea, but at the end of the day, it ends up being cut back so much that it really loses the ability to offer everyone an equitable experience. Often it's also phrased as one size fits all, which isn't exactly a fair idea of what universal design is. Universal design does come with this idea that you want to build in flexibility so that it's not one size fits all so much as it is one solution can be used by a lot of different people, even if they're not all using it in exactly the same way. But sometimes when people think of it as one size fits all, they can either end up in a situation where they feel sort of completely unsure how to proceed and unable to move forward because they don't see a solution that would fit everyone equally, and they forget about the idea that there is that to the greatest extent possible clause in the definition, or it ends up with something where someone thinks that they've come up with a one size fits all solution, but is excluding certain groups and then hasn't planned on the fact that they will still need to make accommodations. And that leads nicely into the final point, which is that it's rarely actually fully universal. And I mentioned that in the definition, it talks about to the greatest extent possible. And it really is about setting a goal and continually striving to be better about this. But it is important to admit that it's not necessarily going to be fully universal. And what that means is that even if you've adopted a universal design approach, you still need to be aware that you may receive accommodation requests, and you need to be prepared to respond to those requests and be able to support people who need further accommodations to be able to use the space, service, or item. So universal design really is a process and not an outcome. It's not assumed or expected that a universal solution will be achieved or achievable for any given design. Rather, universal design should be a goal that a designer strives to achieve. This is from the Center for Excellence in Universal Design, and I think that it's a really great summation of how you should think about this, that it really is about a process of continual improvement and working towards the goal of inclusion. So let's talk a little bit about how you can think about bringing this to your library. So obviously, we're not all going to be able to start from scratch tomorrow. We all have existing library spaces, existing furniture, existing ways that we do our work, workflows, programs, services, everything. And so I want to encourage you to start with small and inexpensive things as sort of a proof of concept of universal design at your library and as an ability to slowly make improvements so that you're always building towards greater inclusion. An example of this that's really easy is rearranging existing furniture and displays, and just how you use your space can go a long way towards things like improving the approach and space for people of various sizes and using various technologies to come and use something. For example, a lot of libraries still have a situation where all their scanners and copiers and all that sort of equipment maybe are in a single room together. Think about whether or not that's really allowing enough space for various people who might be having, say, for example, somebody who has a seeing eye dog versus somebody who's using a wheelchair versus somebody who has their child with them. Is there enough space for people to make use of that space in the way that they need to? Or do you need to rearrange it to allow for greater movement, more different types of approaches, and more different ways of using the space? The same thing with furniture and displays. There's so much you can do with your library's way of using space just by moving things that are very easy to move. And it doesn't even mean getting rid of furniture or displays. It just means rethinking about how you use them, where you have them, how much flexibility you're offering. Are all the same types of seats in one specific area? Maybe you have all of one type of chair in your loud zone. Well, maybe for some people, that's the only chair they can really use. So you should have a couple of those in a quiet zone of your library as well. Even just this defining spaces as different types of zones can be a good step towards universal design that costs little or nothing. And then evaluating your collection. And this doesn't necessarily mean even buying anything more for your collection, but a big part of universal design when it comes to reading is offering different formats. And I like to encourage libraries to really think about what they have in their collection already and how they can do outreach around it. When you're doing book displays, are you including things that people might not know you have, like large print on the subject, magazines on the subject, things that are maybe at sort of a high interest, low reading level type of book on the topic? Are you including audio books when you do these sorts of displays? Same thing with when you share information about your collection on social media or on your website. Are you highlighting that you have things in all these different formats? Another way that if you don't have those sorts of things in your collection, that you can still highlight their availability is that public libraries and many academic libraries can work with their state's library service for the blind library to be able to provide resources to people such as recorded books, braille items, sometimes large print. And while it's usually still referred to in most areas as library service for the blind colloquially, in reality, people who have other types of disabilities are also eligible for that service. So even just highlighting it as part of your collection, the fact that patrons would be able to access these additional resources can really be something that people don't know about that really is life-changing for them. Use it as a way of evaluating future purchases. You can just sort of have universal design, and the principles of universal design is a little bit of a checklist when you're thinking about future signage purchases, future collection purchases, and even future furniture purchases. So that when you are going to allocate money towards something, you're making sure that you're making a selection based on it being usable by the widest number of people possible. Right now, I think a lot of times people pick things based on aesthetics, or it matches something that they have in the past, or recommendations from other people, something they saw at a conference. There's lots of different ways people select these items, but they're not necessarily consciously thinking, okay, how are these going to meet the needs of different people in my setting? Are they going to be flexible enough to be adjustable for different heights? Are they going to be something that's easy enough to move so that even somebody who has a disability can move it, or so that the library staff can move it aside if you need to be able to accommodate someone in a wheelchair? Are tables at the appropriate height for all different types of users? Those are things that won't necessarily make your purchase any more expensive, but they can ensure that the purchases you do make are really ones that you'll be happy with for a long time and you'll be able to use in a lot of different ways. Redesigning signage is another really great way with relatively low cost to have a great improvement. Cutting down on jargon, cutting down on acronyms, increasing the number of ways that you use symbols to convey the information for somebody who's just looking at a glance. All of these can make your library much easier to use for everyone. And they really can be quite inexpensive, since it really just costs the price of reprinting a sign. And then, if you are able to, consider renovations. And certainly that's not necessarily something that you're going to be able to do overnight, but it's more about when you are considering renovations, make sure that universal design is on your radar. Are you making renovation decisions based on making things usable by the widest number of people possible? And I will say that I have followed various different projects with architects, even architects who are used to working in library spaces. And often this is not something that they are prepared to work on or are good at being able to do in a way that's effective for us. In New York City, the Queens Public Library just opened a brand new branch, and they opened it in, I think, September, and by early October, they had already had a lawsuit about accessibility because their architect didn't necessarily take into account universal design, certainly, and not even really full accessibility. So these are things that it shouldn't just be that you rely on the architect. You should really be thinking about it yourself from your expertise as a librarian and your expertise as knowing your community, to really push the architects to make sure that when you do renovations, whether they're big or small, they're meeting the needs of the widest number of people possible. Also keep in mind that something can be a renovation even if it's quite small. It can be fairly affordable to do something like put in an automatic door where there previously was not one, perhaps on a restroom or something like that. So even if you don't have the budget for a completely new library, you can certainly do smaller renovations that can have a big impact on people. And also keep in mind that for all of these things I'm talking about that cost money, there are sometimes grants available, especially when you're aiming to improve inclusion and accessibility in your institution. And a lot of times when you are looking to get those grants, if you can show that it's going to help multiple different segments of your community, that will really make you a lot more successful when you apply for grants. So it's really great to start thinking about it from a universal design standpoint if you are considering pursuing those types of grants and saying not only will it help people with these types of disabilities, but here are the other benefits we think we would see as well. So that's about 10 minutes till the end, and I want to leave some time for questions. I'm not sure if anybody has been chatting them since I can't see that while I'm presenting, but hopefully you'll have some questions for me. If you think of a question later, my email address is here on the screen and also my Twitter handle, so you can feel free to get in touch with me either way, and I'm happy to answer questions or try to point you towards other resources if you're interested.
Carly?
Yes.
All right, yes, we do have a question. Someone asked, Aaron asked, we work with someone with a disability and he is often asked for his opinions on accessibility. How do we use his expertise without casting him as the accessibility person and having him spend his time doing extra work on behalf of the library?
I think that's a really good question. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, not only so that you're not casting someone in a role that they're not comfortable with, but also because not everyone who has a disability is knowledgeable about these topics, interested in these topics, somebody who feels comfortable speaking on behalf of other types of disabilities. So I would say that your best unless that person has a real interest in it themselves. So I have a disability and I happen to find this stuff really interesting. But if it's something where they just happen to be someone who has a disability, you can ask their opinion, but I would make it part of asking a lot of people's opinions. So I would recommend asking patrons, whether you know they have disabilities or not, just surveying widely and trying to specifically reach out to groups that work with people with disabilities so that you can make sure you're including people with disabilities in those types of surveys. Try to have user groups or focus groups of people in your community who have various types of disabilities come in and talk to you about things, because a single perspective isn't necessarily going to catch everything. And it really shouldn't be that person's responsibility to know all the ins and outs of accessibility for every type of person just because they happen to have a certain disability themselves. I don't think that means you certainly have to ignore their suggestions or exclude them from the process, but I think that considering how you can do outreach and get more feedback from other people in your larger community who have disabilities can help to find a way to avoid having that one person be the only voice that you ever rely on.
Okay, we have another question that says, can you give any examples of libraries who have done a good job of this? So I think when that question came in, it was just in terms of other things that you had talked about, but I guess maybe some exemplary libraries that have included universal design.
Sure. I think as we can see with most libraries, there are very few libraries that have the luxury of starting from scratch. So a lot of libraries have done a really good job, I think, of redesigning segments or sections. So for example, the Hennepin County Libraries Children's Collection did a whole redesign so that they have a very universally designed space for kids and teens. And that was a specific project where they really focused on applying universal design. And Inclusive Services at the Brooklyn Public Library has a lot of programming for children and teens that have various types of disabilities. And all of their programming is designed using something that's a framework based on universal design called Universal Design for Learning, which is a way of applying universal design to learning situations. There are also some libraries that do a really good job of it in Europe, because I think that there's been a lot of uptake. In Europe, it's sometimes called Design for All, but there's a lot of libraries that have been really focused on that. So there is a new library that was just built in Finland I think it's the National Library of Finland that just had a new building opened. And the entire thing, the whole goal is to be as inclusive as possible throughout the entire library. But I think it is important to think about these libraries that do small segments of their library, because that's a lot more manageable than thinking, okay, I'm going to tear this place down and start from scratch. There are always ways that you can say, I'm going to do a refresh on the reference desk, or I'm going to do a new way of storing our collections. And that's much more manageable than trying to start from scratch, I think.
We have another question about services to online students. And Esther elaborates a little bit more, saying e-learners access to course content, incorporating learning management systems. Just wondering how to incorporate this into online learning.
Yeah, so online learning is very, very tricky for accessibility because unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that we provide access to online, we don't actually control, as you all know. We're working with vendors for everything from the course management system to the databases, and even the ways that we communicate with students if we're using something like some sort of video chat program or something like that. So I think that what I would say is the key points I always tell people to think about are first, negotiate with the vendors. Make this something that's at the center of their mind and try to tie it to renewals. Talk about how it's a priority for you when you're deciding what services you're going to go with, about whether or not they're accessible. In an educational setting, try to work with the faculty. A lot of times faculty aren't as knowledgeable about this as the libraries are. So a lot of times, even if the library segment of the learning management system isn't necessarily a problem, the classes that the students are taking will have problems. So offering this as something that the library can offer support to faculty on can often, on a lot of campuses, be a really huge boon to those faculty. They want to know more about it, but they're just not even sure where to start. And then I think a really important thing is knowing that whenever you're using those sorts of systems, you're not going to be able to achieve 100% accessibility for everyone. So what you should be doing is tracking the problems and providing a way for students who are having difficulties to get in touch with you. Maybe have a way to anonymously report problems, but definitely have a very clear, explicitly stated, obvious way that they can get in touch to say, I can't access this, and then be ready to have an alternative for them. And just try to be as flexible with people as you can be. One thing to keep in mind when you're posting things, a lot of PDFs are not very accessible. And you can make them accessible, but it's a huge project to such a degree that usually my advice to people is to just offer a different format rather than try to make an accessible PDF. So if a student is coming to you and saying they're having trouble accessing some items like scanned documents that a professor adds to a course site, one of the things you can do is if you can transfer that information into, for example, a Word document, a lot of times that'll solve a lot of the problems.
We have a comment from someone that says that colleges often have disability coordinators that can help librarians think through some of these issues. This person used to work in a disability office, and we were so happy to proactively help folks who wanted classrooms to be more accessible.
Definitely. I think any library that has access to disability services should partner with them. And that can be true even if you don't work in an academic setting. Even public libraries, I think, can sometimes find ways of partnering with local organizations that help people with disabilities, local government offices that help people with disabilities or provide services for them. And those types of partnerships can be really valuable.
Well, thank you so much, Carli. We were out of time. That went by really quickly. And so I want to thank you, especially Carli, for your time today and your presentation. I think we've all walked away with some new information that we can use and incorporate in our everyday work lives. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact Carli directly at the contact information on the screen, or if you have other questions about the webinar or anything like that, you can contact the host of today's conference, and that's on our conference website. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive a survey on today's presentation, and we would really appreciate if you would complete that with your feedback. Again, we value your feedback greatly, and we can improve when we know what we can do better on. So again, the last page of that survey will also have information about the certificate displaying credits earned. So if you have CEU requirements, there'll be some information on that. Thanks again to everyone, and be sure to join us tomorrow morning starting at 9 a.m. for the webinar Nurturing Relationships to Cultivate Resilience. Thank you so much.
Thanks.